All right, today we are diving into a narrative that basically flips the official history of public health completely on its head. The source material we're looking at presents the last few decades not as a mission to save lives, but as a calculated 40-year plan.
And this is the question right at the heart of it all. The source material asks us to consider this. Was one of the most devastating epidemics of our time really just a tragic accident? Or was it the opening move in a much larger and honestly a far more disturbing global strategy?
So that brings us to what the source calls the Gnostic Indictment. Now, that word Gnostic, it just means a kind of hidden, secret knowledge. The indictment here is that the story we've all been told about global health is a deliberate cover story, concealing a much, much darker truth about how things really operate.
And here you can see the two stories side by side. The public narrative is that the whole biosecurity apparatus was built to protect us. But the indictment claims the total opposite, that it was designed from the ground up to use disease for profit and ultimately for totalitarian control. This is the absolute bedrock of the entire argument we're examining today.
And here's the real kicker. The argument is that Africa was the laboratory, that the methods, the narratives, the whole infrastructure used to manage the HIV/AIDS crisis there, well, that became the exact playbook for what the entire world experienced 4 decades later with COVID-19.
But, this indictment goes way deeper than just the response to the virus. It actually questions where the virus even came from in the first place, suggesting it wasn't some random accident of nature, but an invention of science.
The source lays out this timeline, and it argues that this is just not a coincidence. It starts back in 1971 with a U.S. government program, the SVCP, which was supposedly engineering new retroviruses. Fast forward to the late 70s, and you have these very targeted vaccine trials. And then, boom, right after, an explosion of AIDS cases in the exact same groups of people.
So the narrative puts forward this idea that HIV is what's called a synthetic chimera. Think of it like a biological cut-and-paste job. They claim it was a lab-created virus, combining bits of a cow virus with a sheep virus. And the allegation is that this new bug was cooked up inside that very same special virus cancer program. Okay, so if the virus was engineered in a lab, the next logical question is, how did it get out? Well, the material we're looking at points to a coordinated, two-pronged attack on two totally different populations, happening at the exact same time.
This chart really spells out the two alleged fronts of this deployment. On one side, you have a hepatitis B vaccine trial targeting gay men in the United States. On the other, a massive smallpox eradication campaign targeting the general population of Central Africa. Two completely different public health programs, but, according to this source, one single, hidden purpose.
Now, the source is incredibly specific about the American side of the operation. It highlights the CDC's hepatitis B vaccine trial, which specifically recruited promiscuous gay men in Manhattan, San Francisco, and LA. And here's what it calls the smoking gun. These exact cities and this exact demographic became the very first epicenters of the AIDS crisis in America.
And the narrative's conclusion? It's blunt. The virus was delivered in a syringe. This is a direct claim that the epidemic was spread by doctors, that the medical treatment itself, on 2 different continents, was the weapon that kicked the whole thing off.
So the indictment then pivots from the virus's origin to the official response. And it calls this a two-part fraud. One part was a profitable, lethal cure pushed in the West, and the other was a giant statistical lie in Africa, both designed to control the whole story. And this is where the document points a finger directly at Dr. Anthony Fauci, identifying him as the key architect of this alleged fraud. It claims he took over all the AIDS funding, systematically crushed any talk of cheap, off-patent treatments, and instead forced through a single, very profitable, and allegedly toxic drug as the only option. Now, this might be the most explosive claim in the whole narrative, that the cure was actually deadlier than the disease. It describes the drug AZT, not as a treatment, but as a failed chemo drug, a lethal poison that just wiped out a person's bone marrow and was, it alleges, responsible for countless deaths that were blamed on the virus itself. So let's jump back to the continent the source calls the African laboratory. If the strategy in the US was all about a toxic cure, the indictment says the strategy in Africa was based on pure statistical deception. So how did they pull this off? Well, the key, allegedly, was something called the Bangui Definition, which the WHO established in 1985. First, it let doctors diagnose AIDS with no test needed. Second, the symptoms it listed, fever, weight loss, diarrhea, were things that were already incredibly common.
And this led to step 3, relabeling common treatable diseases of poverty like malaria and TB as incurable AIDS. The result? You get a massive artificial pandemic on paper.
So you might be asking, why does this history from the 80s even matter now? Well, the material claims this was never just about one disease. It was about creating a repeatable blueprint for control. A blueprint that could be scaled up from a continental test run to a full global deployment. This artificially inflated crisis, the scary story of a continent about to collapse, became the perfect justification for massive foreign intervention. It opened the floodgates for billions of dollars in aid, which the source claims was just a cover for testing experimental drugs and pushing aggressive population control measures. And this is where the narrative connects that history to some of the biggest players in global health today. It alleges that figures like Bill Gates basically inherited and perfected this model, using the cover of philanthropy to launch a whole new era of biomedical control.
The document points to direct quotes, like this one, as a kind of public confession. Here you have Bill Gates, on a TED stage, explicitly listing new vaccines as a tool for reducing the world population. This material doesn't see that as a slip of the tongue, it sees it as a crystal clear statement of intent.
So the argument is that the exact same patterns of intervention from the 80s are being played out today, just on a much bigger global scale. It points to a legacy of aggressive population control, vaccine campaigns that went horribly wrong, and the use of the African continent as an unregulated lab for new drugs and technologies.
And all of this brings us to the final thesis, that the HIV/AIDS response in Africa was the blueprint, the beta test, for what the entire world just went through with COVID-19. The source draws these direct lines: an inflated crisis built on fear, the suppression of cheap and easy treatments, the mandate of new, profitable experimental drugs, and using the whole crisis as a way to grab more control. So we've walked through a really complex and, frankly, a deeply disturbing indictment. It doesn't really offer any easy answers, but it does leave us with one final, chilling question. If this really was a 40-year test and the global pandemic was the big rollout, then what exactly is the final exam?